The sun was barely up when the sound of an old piano filled the small living room of a tiny house at the edge of town. It wasn't a grand piano, not even close. Its wooden edges were chipped, and one of the pedals squeaked every time it was pressed. But to her, it was more than just an instrument. It was her world. Every morning before school, she would sit on that worn-out stool and play. Sometimes she played softly so her mother wouldn't wake up too early, and sometimes she played with all her heart, letting the notes pour out of her like pieces of her soul. She had never gone to a music academy. She didn't have a teacher. Everything she knew she learned from watching videos online and listening carefully to recordings of great pianists. She would play them over and over again, trying to catch every little detail, the pauses, the pressure of each key, the way emotion could be heard in silence. She wasn't just playing, she was feeling. Her mother worked long hours at a diner in town and money was always tight. Still, she never complained. She just smiled when she saw her daughter practicing, saying, "Keep playing, maybe one day the world will listen." Those words stayed with her every single day. She didn't dream of fame or money. She just wanted people to feel something when she played, the same way she felt when she heard beautiful music. One day, while scrolling through her phone, she came across a post about a televised music competition. It wasn't just any show. It was one of the biggest in the world. Musicians from all over came to perform in front of famous judges, people whose names were known in every concert hall. Among them was a maestro known for his brutal honesty. He was a legend, but he was also feared. Many contestants had left the stage in tears after facing his harsh criticism. Still, he was respected because no one could deny his genius. At first, she laughed at the idea of joining. A girl from a small town with no training and an old piano competing on a world stage. It sounded impossible, but something deep inside her whispered, "Why not?" Maybe it was her mother's words echoing in her mind, or maybe it was just a small spark of courage. She filled out the online form, recorded a short video of her playing a soft piece she had written herself, and sent it in. Weeks passed. She didn't think much of it anymore. Then one evening, while helping her mother in the kitchen, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened it. Her heart nearly stopped when she read the first line. "Congratulations. You have been selected to perform on the Global Young Musicians Showcase." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her mother looked at her, confused, until she shouted, "Mom, I got in." They both laughed and cried at the same time. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering, "See? The world is starting to listen." The next few weeks were a blur of excitement and nerves. The show would be filmed in a large city far from their hometown. A car from the production team came to pick her up. She packed her clothes, a small notebook of songs she'd written, and a photo of her mother. Her hand shook as she closed the suitcase. She had never traveled this far alone. When she arrived at the studio, her eyes widened. The building was enormous. Bright lights, tall cameras, people with headsets rushing everywhere. Other contestants were already there, practicing on shiny grand pianos that looked nothing like hers at home. Their clothes were elegant, their postures perfect. She suddenly felt small, like she didn't belong. A kind woman from the staff led her to a waiting room. She could hear the faint sound of music from nearby, fast fingers dancing across keys, laughter, confidence. She took a deep breath and sat quietly, running her hands nervously over her knees. She whispered to herself, "Just play from your heart. That's all you know." When her name was called for rehearsal, she stepped into the main stage area. The sight of it almost took her breath away. Bright lights pointed at the piano in the center, surrounded by rows of empty seats. Cameras were mounted on every side, waiting to capture every movement. On the far end of the stage sat the judges, 4 of them. 3 were smiling politely, but one man in the middle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, face unreadable. She recognized him instantly. The maestro. She had watched him on TV before. He was brilliant but intimidating. Musicians feared his comments because he didn't hold back. He valued perfection and precision, and anything less seemed to irritate him. And now he was sitting there, staring at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Name?" the host asked. She introduced herself softly, trying to steady her voice. "And what will you be playing?" he asked. "A piece I composed myself," she replied. The maestro raised an eyebrow. "Your own composition?" His tone was calm but carried a hint of disbelief. "That's bold for someone so young." She nodded nervously. The other judges smiled, encouraging her to begin. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. But before she could play, the maestro leaned forward and said, "You seem nervous. Maybe this stage is a bit too much for you." The words hit her like a slap. The audience, who had been quietly waiting, let out small murmurs. A few even chuckled. She froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Her throat felt tight, and she could hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She looked at the piano in front of her, so polished, so foreign, and thought of her old one back home. She thought of her mother standing by the kitchen door every morning, listening quietly while pretending to cook. And somehow that thought gave her strength. She looked up, smiled politely, and said softly, "Maybe, but I'll try my best." The audience fell silent. Even the maestro's expression changed slightly, not softer, but curious. She turned back to the piano, closed her eyes, and took a slow breath. For a second, the noise of the cameras, the whispers, and the bright lights all disappeared. There was only her and the keys. The first note she played was soft, almost like a whisper. Then another followed, and another, weaving together a melody so delicate that the room seemed to breathe with it. The tune carried a sense of innocence, but also something deeper, a quiet strength. It was as if she was telling a story without words, a story of dreams born in silence. As she played, the tension in her shoulders eased. The music flowed naturally, like water finding its way through stone. She forgot about the audience, the judges, even the cameras. There was just the sound, pure and alive. When she finished, there was a long pause. The hall stayed quiet for several seconds. Then slowly applause began to rise. It started small but grew louder and louder. People stood up. The girl blinked, unsure how to react. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't mean to shed. The other judges smiled warmly. One leaned forward and said, "That was beautiful." Another added, "You have a natural gift. It came straight from your heart." The maestro, however, didn't clap. He simply looked at her, tapping his pen on the table. Then he said, "Your emotions were strong, but your technique is undisciplined. You played with feeling, yes, but music also requires control. Without that, it falls apart." The air in the room grew tense again. The applause faded. The girl lowered her gaze but nodded respectfully. She didn't argue. She just said, "Thank you, sir." After the rehearsal, she walked backstage, trying not to cry. The comment hurt, but she couldn't let it destroy her confidence. She found a quiet corner and sat down, replaying his words in her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't trained enough. But deep down, she also knew that what she played had meaning. It was real. It was hers. That night, she called her mother from the hotel room. Her voice trembled a little as she said, "He didn't like it." Her mother stayed silent for a moment, then said softly, "Did you play the way you wanted to?" "Yes," she whispered, "then that's enough. You can't make everyone feel what you feel, but someone out there did. Someone understood." Her mother's words comforted her. She promised herself she wouldn't give up. The next day was the live show, the real performance that would be seen by millions. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of city traffic outside. For the first time, she wasn't scared. She was ready to let the world hear her truth. And somewhere in another hotel across the city, the maestro sat alone in his room, reviewing the list of contestants. When he reached her name, he paused. He didn't show it, but something about her music had stayed with him, a small, stubborn echo in the back of his mind. He didn't understand it yet, but he would soon. The next day would be the start of something none of them could forget. The morning of the live show arrived faster than she expected. The studio was buzzing with activity when she walked in. Bright lights shone down on the stage, camera crews hurried across the floor, and contestants were busy rehearsing their pieces one last time. Some looked calm and confident, while others paced nervously. She stood quietly at the edge, holding her hands together to stop them from shaking. Her stomach was tight with nerves, but her heart was steady. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of since the day she first touched a piano. A woman from the crew walked up and handed her a number tag to pin on her dress. "You're up in the second half of the show," she said with a quick smile. "You're doing great. Just breathe and enjoy it, enjoy it." The words sounded simple, but right now, enjoying anything felt impossible. She had barely slept the night before. The thought of performing in front of millions of people, and in front of that same cold-faced maestro, kept her wide awake. Still, She told herself that this was her chance to prove that feelings mattered as much as perfect notes. The first contestants went on stage. From backstage, she watched their performances on a screen. Every note, every move, every bow looked flawless. They were trained, polished, confident. The audience clapped politely after each performance, but no one seemed truly moved. They were waiting for something different, even if they didn't know what. She kept replaying the maestro's words in her head from the day before. Your emotions were strong, but your technique is undisciplined. He had meant it as a criticism, but she couldn't help thinking about what those words really meant. Maybe she didn't have perfect control, but wasn't music supposed to be about emotion? About life? Her playing might not have been clean, but it was real. When the break ended, one of the assistants came running to her, whispering, "You're next." She took a deep breath and followed them toward the stage entrance. The bright lights from beyond the curtain made her squint. She could hear the applause fading from the previous contestant. Her hands were cold. She rubbed them together, whispering to herself, "You can do this. Just play what you feel." As she stepped onto the stage, the room grew quiet. The cameras turned toward her, following every movement. The audience was a sea of faces, and at the center table sat the judges. The maestro was there, leaning back in his chair with that same unreadable expression. His eyes followed her as she walked to the piano. She bowed politely, and the host introduced her with a bright smile, saying she would perform her own original piece. The maestro raised his eyebrows slightly. Before she could sit down, he leaned toward his microphone and said, "Another original composition? You must be very sure of your talent to take such a risk on live television." His tone was calm, but it carried that familiar edge of sarcasm. A few people in the audience chuckled. The girl froze for half a second, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. Then she smiled softly and said, "I just want to share how I feel through music, sir." Her voice was gentle but steady. The room quieted again. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. The piano was so perfectly tuned that it almost felt alive beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, let out a slow breath, and began. The first notes floated softly across the hall. It was a delicate melody, gentle, pure, like a small voice whispering a secret. The audience leaned in, drawn by the quiet power of it. Then the music began to grow, fuller and deeper, like waves building strength. Every note carried emotion, hope, sadness, courage. It wasn't the kind of piece made to impress. It was made to connect. People in the audience forgot they were watching a competition. The judges, who had been taking notes all night, stopped writing. Even the maestro, who was known for never showing emotion, tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands. As the melody reached its middle section, she introduced something unexpected, a bold, passionate rhythm that twisted the piece into a new direction. It wasn't classical anymore. It was something entirely her own, part modern, part timeless. Her fingers moved faster now, each note sharper, every pause deliberate. The music rose and fell like a story being told without words, a story of a young girl who had spent years dreaming alone in a small room, believing one day the world might listen. When she played the final note, she let it ring for a long moment before lifting her hands. Silence. The entire hall was frozen, the sound still hanging in the air. And then suddenly the audience erupted into applause. People stood up. Some even cheered. The other judges smiled broadly, one of them clapping so hard his papers fell off the desk. But the maestro didn't move. He sat perfectly still, eyes locked on her. His expression was hard to read, part surprise, part pride, part resistance. Finally, he leaned toward the microphone. The room went silent again, waiting. "That was unexpected," he said slowly. "There is real emotion in your playing. But emotion without discipline can easily turn to chaos." He paused, then added, "Still, I will admit, you have something rare." The audience clapped again, sensing that even he couldn't completely hide his respect. The host smiled and said, "That was truly beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us." She bowed again, tears forming in her eyes. As she left the stage, she could still hear the applause echoing behind her. Backstage, one of the crew members handed her a bottle of water, grinning. "You were amazing. That was something special," he said. She thanked him quietly, her hands still trembling. She couldn't believe it was over. The sound of her music still echoed in her head like it didn't want to leave. She found a quiet corner and sat down, trying to catch her breath. Around her, other contestants congratulated her, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was the maestro's words. He hadn't completely praised her, but for someone like him, even a small acknowledgement meant everything. It was enough to make her believe she had done something right. When the show ended, she went back to her hotel room, still dressed in her performance gown. She sat by the window looking at the city lights outside. Her phone buzzed with messages, people from her town, friends from school, even strangers who had seen the broadcast. Some called her performance inspiring. Others said it made them cry. She read every message with disbelief and gratitude. A few minutes later, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found one of the producers standing there. He smiled and said, "Congratulations. The judges are still talking about your performance. The maestro himself asked to see your music sheet. Did you really write it all by yourself?" She nodded. "Yes, I did. I just wrote what I felt." "Well, you made them all feel it too," he said kindly before leaving. She closed the door and sat back down, covering her face with her hands. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry. Not out of sadness, but out of relief. She had faced her fear, stood before the world, and stayed true to herself. No matter what happened next, that moment could never be taken away. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, headlines began to appear online. Teen pianist moves audience to tears with original composition. Clips of her performance spread quickly across social media. People from different countries were sharing the video, leaving comments like, "She reminded me why I love music," and "This is what true talent looks like." Her name became one of the top trends within hours. Back home, her mother watched the replay on their old TV. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You did it, my girl. The world is listening now." Meanwhile, in his quiet dressing room at the studio, the maestro sat alone. The applause had long faded, but something about that performance still echoed in his mind. He had heard countless musicians over his career, flawless, trained, perfect. But there was something different about that girl. Her playing wasn't about showing off skill. It was about saying something real. It reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, long before fame or perfection had mattered. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the reflection of his own hands. Once he too had played from the heart. Somewhere along the way he had forgotten that. For a brief moment he smiled, a small, private smile that no one saw. In her hotel room, the girl sat on her bed with her small notebook open. She began to write down a new melody, one that had been forming in her mind since the moment she left the stage. It wasn't for another competition or audience. It was just for her, a promise to never lose that feeling again. Outside her window, the city was quiet. Somewhere far below, someone was playing a tune on a street corner. She listened for a moment and smiled. Music was everywhere if you knew how to hear it. And for the first time in her life, she believed that her story with the piano was only just beginning. The following day felt unreal. Everywhere she went, people smiled at her. Strangers stopped her in the hallway, and the crew members from the show greeted her with admiration. Some asked for photos, others just wanted to tell her how her music had touched them. She didn't know how to react. She was grateful, but part of her still felt like that small-town girl who practiced on an old piano in a quiet living room. Fame was never what she wanted. She just wanted to be heard. And now somehow the whole world was listening. The show's producers invited her to an interview early that morning. She sat in a small studio with bright lights and cameras pointed at her face. The host smiled warmly and asked, "How does it feel to move millions of people with your music?" She smiled shyly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't expect any of this," she said softly. "I just played what I felt." "That's what made it special," the host replied. "Even the maestro seemed different after your performance." She hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's a great musician. I learned a lot from his words." The truth was, she still thought about his comment. Emotion without discipline can easily turn to chaos. She didn't take it as an insult anymore. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could learn to combine both, the heart and the technique. She wanted to grow, not to prove him wrong, but to become the best version of herself. After the interview, she was told she'd be performing again in a few days for a special live finale, where selected contestants would return to play with the orchestra. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the next part. The maestro himself would conduct. The thought of performing while he led the orchestra made her both nervous and excited. She wasn't sure if he had chosen her personally or if it was just part of the show's plan, but either way, it meant something. It was a chance to stand before him again, and this time she wanted him to see not just a talented girl, but a true musician. That night, she called her mother again. Her voice was full of energy as she shared the news. Her mother laughed with joy and said, "You see, every challenge comes with a purpose." Maybe he said those words so you could learn more about yourself. Her mother always had a way of turning everything into hope. "I'll make you proud," she whispered. "You already have," her mother replied. For the next few days, she practiced for hours. The producers had given her access to one of the rehearsal studios with a grand piano. The room was soundproof and quiet, the kind of space she'd always dreamed of. Each day she worked on perfecting her piece. This time she decided to take the melody she had played before and build upon it, stronger, deeper, and more structured. She wanted to keep the emotion alive but also show her growth. Sometimes when she played late into the night, she imagined the maestro standing nearby watching her silently, waiting to see if she could balance feeling and control. The thought pushed her harder. On the day of the final rehearsal, she arrived early. The orchestra was already setting up, tuning instruments and arranging sheet music. The sound of violins, cellos, and flutes filled the air, blending into a soft chaos that made her heart race. She took a seat quietly at the side of the stage, waiting for her turn. Then he walked in, the maestro. His presence immediately commanded attention. He wore a simple black suit and carried his conductor's baton with an effortless confidence. The orchestra members straightened as soon as they saw him. He nodded to a few of them, then looked around the room. When his eyes met hers, she felt a chill down her spine. But this time there was no mocking smile, no raised eyebrow. He just gave a small nod. "Good morning," he said in his calm, precise tone. "Let's begin." The rehearsal started with other musicians first. The maestro's focus was sharp. He gave instructions with quick hand gestures, correcting even the smallest mistakes. He wasn't cruel, but he demanded perfection. His ability to hear every detail amazed her. When her turn finally came, he motioned for her to take her place at the piano. She walked slowly across the stage, heart pounding. The entire orchestra turned their attention to her. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. The maestro looked at her and said, "We'll follow your lead in the beginning. Don't rush. Feel the rhythm. Make it breathe." It was the first kind thing he had ever said to her. She nodded, fingers ready on the keys. He raised his baton, gave a small cue, and she began to play. The sound was magical. The orchestra joined in softly, weaving around her melody like a warm blanket. The violins echoed her theme while the cellos filled the air with depth and emotion. The flutes carried lightness and the drums added power. She felt like she was floating, no longer alone in her sound. The maestro's movements were graceful yet firm, guiding the musicians with confidence. For the first time, she wasn't nervous in front of him. They were connected through the music. When the piece ended, there was a long silence before he spoke. "That was better," he said finally. "You're learning to listen, to control but not suffocate the feeling." His voice was calm, almost approving. "Let's do it again." They played it several times, each version smoother than the last. By the end of the session, she was exhausted but happy. As the musicians packed up, the maestro approached her. She stood quickly, unsure what to expect. "You have something rare," he said quietly. "Most people play to be heard. You play to speak. Don't lose that." She blinked, too stunned to reply. Before she could thank him, he turned and walked away, his long coat sweeping behind him. But those words stayed with her. They meant more than any applause ever could. The day of the live finale arrived. The stage looked even grander than before. The hall was full, cameras surrounded the orchestra, and millions were watching from their homes. She waited backstage, dressed in a simple but elegant gown. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her heart was calm. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a conversation between her and the music. When her turn came, the announcer introduced her warmly, mentioning her viral performance from earlier in the week. The audience applauded before she even stepped out. She walked onto the stage, smiled shyly, and took her place at the piano. The maestro gave her a steady look, then lifted his baton. The first notes began softly, just like before, but now the orchestra followed her lead perfectly. The melody she played had evolved. It carried a new strength. Each rise and fall of the music felt intentional, balanced and alive. She poured everything she had into every note, her emotions flowing freely but guided by precision. It was no longer just a piece, it was a story of growth, courage, and connection. Midway through the performance, she caught sight of people in the audience wiping their eyes. Even the camera crew seemed mesmerized, barely moving. When the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence. Then the entire hall erupted. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the space. People stood cheering, shouting her name. She looked up at the maestro. For the first time, he smiled. After the performance, she walked backstage with tears in her eyes. The orchestra members congratulated her warmly. A few of them even told her that her playing had reminded them why they loved music. She didn't know what to say except, "Thank you." A few minutes later, the maestro entered the room. Everyone went quiet. He looked around, then approached her. "You did well," he said simply. "Very well." He paused, then added, "Do you know why I pushed you?" She shook her head. "Because I saw something in you the first time you played. You reminded me of myself, before I forgot what music was truly about." His voice softened, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Technique can be learned, but heart is something you either have or you don't. You have it. Never let anyone take that from you. She swallowed hard, unable to speak. He gave her one last nod and walked away. For a moment, she just stood there, trying to hold back tears. That night, after the show ended, she walked outside the studio. The air was cool and the sky above the city shimmered with stars. She sat on a bench nearby, still in her gown, and looked up. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the faint hum of the city. Somewhere out there, her mother was probably watching the replay again, smiling proudly. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the flood of messages. Among them was one that caught her attention. It was from the show's producer. It said, "The maestro wants to invite you to perform with his orchestra next month. He said it would be an honor." Her hands trembled as she read it. She didn't reply right away. She just smiled to herself, eyes glistening. She had started as a nervous girl with an old piano and a dream. Now she had shared her heart with the world, and even the man who once doubted her had seen her light. As she sat there, a quiet laugh escaped her lips. She didn't need trophies or fame. All she needed was this feeling, the peace that came from knowing she had stayed true to herself. The night breeze carried the faint sound of music from somewhere nearby. She listened to it for a while, then closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stages, new lessons. But tonight, for the first time, she truly believed she belonged. The studio lights dimmed slightly, but the air inside the hall was still heavy with excitement. Everyone had just witnessed something special, something few expected from a young girl who had walked onto that stage trembling minutes earlier. The audience was still talking about her performance when the maestro rose from his seat. His sharp eyes studied her, and the faint smirk on his lips made the room go quiet again. She stood beside the piano, breathing slowly, her heart still racing from the performance. The sound of the last note was still echoing in her chest. She didn't know what the judges would say, but she knew she had given everything she had. The piece she played was her story, her emotion. Her entire heart poured into the piano. She waited, trying to read the expression on the maestro's face, but it revealed nothing, just a calm, almost cold stillness. The maestro took a step forward. "That was interesting," he said slowly, his tone making people shift in their seats. The audience held its breath. "But it wasn't perfect. You broke rhythm, you changed phrasing, and some of your dynamics were far from what the composer intended." He gave a small, almost teasing smile. "Let me show you how this piece is truly meant to sound." There was a soft gasp in the audience. The other judges exchanged quick glances. The girl blinked, unsure of what to do. She hadn't expected this. The maestro, a man whose reputation for perfection was known across the world, was about to play her piece on live television. He motioned her to step aside and walked to the piano with the confidence of someone who believed no one could ever challenge him. The girl stepped back politely, folding her hands in front of her, her palms still trembling slightly. She wasn't angry. In fact, she felt a strange, calm curiosity. She wondered how he would interpret it. The maestro sat down, adjusted the bench slightly, and gave a short nod to the cameraman. Then with one deep breath, he began to play. The first few notes came out flawlessly, as expected. His fingers moved with skill and control that came from decades of practice. The melody flowed beautifully, smooth and balanced. The audience nodded. some whispering that this was what true mastery looked like. The girl watched quietly, her eyes following every movement of his hands. But soon she realized something. The way he played, though technically brilliant, lacked something. It didn't have the small imperfections, the heartbeat, the feeling that she had poured into the same notes. And then it happened. He reached the section where her arrangement had changed slightly, where she had taken the liberty to shift tempo and weave in her own phrasing, expressing her emotions rather than following the strict sheet. The maestro hesitated for the smallest second. His eyes flickered to the keys as if something was missing. He tried again, adjusting to her version, but the rhythm felt unfamiliar. His fingers paused mid-flow, and for a moment the room went completely silent. A single wrong note echoed faintly through the speakers. He cleared his throat softly, pretending to adjust his position, but the small mistake had already broken the perfect image. People noticed. The other judges leaned forward. Even the camera focused on his hands, capturing the hesitation. The girl stood there, still and polite, not showing a hint of pride or satisfaction. She didn't want to embarrass him. She respected him deeply. After all, he was the reason she had worked so hard, listening to his old recordings, learning from his technique. But she also knew something he didn't. Music wasn't about proving who was better. It was about connection, about honesty. The maestro continued playing, trying to regain his flow, but every few bars he ran into a rhythm that didn't fit what he knew. Her version had emotional pauses and subtle transitions that weren't written in the score. They came from feeling, not theory. By the time he reached the end, his performance, while still impressive, felt uncertain, almost fragile. When he lifted his hands from the keys, the applause was polite but not wild. It was respectful, not emotional. He turned slightly toward the girl. His confident expression softened, though he tried not to show it. "Well," he said, trying to sound light, "your version certainly took creative liberties." The girl smiled gently, not defensive at all. "I didn't mean to change it too much," she said softly. "I just played it how I felt it." Something in her tone made the audience melt. It wasn't arrogance. It was sincerity. She wasn't claiming to be better, just honest. The maestro stood there holding his composure. "Music," he replied, "is a discipline, a structure. Feelings are fine, but one must always respect the original work." She looked at him and nodded slightly. "I understand. But sometimes," she said carefully, "the structure changes when life does." Her words lingered in the air. The crowd didn't move, as if waiting for what would happen next. The maestro didn't respond immediately. His eyes softened just for a moment, as though her sentence had reached somewhere deep inside him. The host, sensing the tension, stepped forward to break the silence. "That was quite a moment," he said, smiling awkwardly. "A rare sight indeed, seeing both generations interpret the same piece in their own way." The audience laughed lightly, easing the mood. But the maestro didn't speak again. He simply gave a slight nod and returned to his seat. The girl sat quietly beside the stage, her heart still beating fast, unsure whether she had done something wrong or right. The show moved on to the next performer, but the energy had changed. People in the audience kept looking back at the girl, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some said the maestro was rude for interrupting her. Others said he had only been trying to teach her. But everyone agreed on one thing: her music had touched them in a way his hadn't. Backstage, crew members congratulated her quietly, saying her performance was the highlight of the night. A few of them even told her they had tears in their eyes when she played. She smiled shyly, thanking them, though she still felt overwhelmed. She sat in a corner holding her hands together, remembering every sound, every pause from her time at the piano. A few minutes later, she saw the maestro walking by with his assistant. His face looked thoughtful, not angry. Their eyes met for a brief second. He didn't say anything, but he gave a small nod, one that almost looked like acknowledgement. Then he walked away. That single gesture meant more to her than any trophy. Later that night, when the episode aired on television, the scene became the most talked-about moment. Social media exploded with clips and comments. Some people criticized the maestro while others defended him, but almost everyone praised the young pianist for her grace, her composure, and her raw talent. They said her performance felt alive, like she had reached through the screen and touched their hearts. She didn't read all the comments. Her phone buzzed nonstop. But she spent the night in her small hotel room, sitting by the window looking out at the city lights. She felt both proud and confused. She hadn't meant to start a debate or make anyone look bad. All she wanted was to share what music meant to her. And somehow that honesty had turned into something much bigger. The next morning, reporters waited outside the studio, eager for interviews. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering how proud she was. Her father stood silently beside them, eyes glassy with emotion. It was the first time he'd seen his daughter play in front of the world. He had always known she had something special, but seeing the world recognize it made his heart full. At breakfast, one of the show's producers approached their table. "The maestro wants to meet you privately before you leave," he said politely. The girl froze. Her mother looked at her with wide eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked the producer. He nodded. "Yes." He said he has something to say. Nervous but curious, the girl followed the producer to a quiet rehearsal room behind the main hall. Inside, the maestro was standing by the grand piano, his back turned, staring out the window. The morning sun reflected off the instrument's polished surface. He turned when he heard the door open. For the first time, his expression wasn't stern. It was calm, even gentle. "You play with heart," he said, his voice softer than it had been before. "That's something you can't teach." She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I was hard on you. Too hard, maybe. But that's how I was taught. Music is everything to me. Sometimes I forget it's supposed to be beautiful, too." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Did I make you angry?" He gave a small laugh. "No," he said honestly. "You surprised me. And that's not something that happens often." He walked to the piano and touched the keys lightly. "The way you played, it wasn't what the composer wrote, but it was real. You reminded me why I started playing in the first place." The girl's eyes widened slightly. She had never imagined she would hear such words from him. It felt unreal. He smiled faintly, like a man remembering an old dream. "Keep playing like that," he said. "Don't lose it. The world needs more of that kind of honesty." She nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "I will." When she left the room, she carried more than praise. She carried understanding, a lesson that would stay with her forever. Perfection wasn't the goal. Expression was. And even the most skilled maestro could forget that sometimes. Later that day, when she boarded her train home, she looked out at the passing fields, clutching the small envelope of her competition certificate. She didn't win any official prize that night, but deep down she knew she had gained something far more valuable. Respect, not just from others, but from herself, and far away. In that quiet rehearsal room, the maestro sat alone at the piano long after everyone had left, replaying her version of the piece in his mind. For the first time in years, he smiled to himself, not as a teacher, not as a critic, but as a man who had just rediscovered the soul of music. The sun rose gently over the city the next morning, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. It was a quiet morning. Yet inside the television studio, phones were ringing, producers were talking fast, and emails were flooding in. Overnight, the video clip of the young pianist's performance had spread like wildfire. People from every corner of the world were watching, sharing, and writing about what had happened between her and the maestro. The scene where she played her heart out and then the maestro stumbled trying to imitate her version was everywhere. In her small hotel room, she woke up to her mother's voice calling softly, telling her that she needed to check her phone. When she finally looked at it, she was shocked. There were hundreds of messages, some from friends she hadn't spoken to in years, others from journalists, and many from complete strangers who said her music had made them cry. She sat on the bed, her heart full, not knowing how to react. It felt unreal, like a dream she hadn't asked for. Her father smiled quietly as he watched her read one message after another. He wasn't a man of many words, but the pride in his eyes said everything. "You did something special," he said. "You made people feel something." She nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. It wasn't fame she had been looking for. It was just honesty. She had played because it was the only way she knew how to express herself. Yet now the world seemed to be watching her. It was overwhelming and beautiful all at once. By afternoon, she was invited to a live morning show to talk about the experience. The producer told her that millions of viewers wanted to hear what she had to say. Nervous but curious, she agreed. When she arrived at the studio, people clapped as she walked in. She wasn't used to that kind of attention. Cameras followed her and makeup artists hurried around. fixing her hair and touching up her face. She smiled shyly at everyone, still the same humble girl from a small town who loved to play piano in her living room. When the interview began, the host asked her gentle questions about her childhood, her love for music, and how it felt to be on stage with the famous Maestro. She spoke simply, honestly, saying that she never wanted to compete with anyone. She said, "I just wanted to play something that felt like me." That line caught everyone's heart. It was replayed over and over later on social media. The host asked if she had seen the Maestro since that night. She nodded softly. "Yes," she said. "He spoke to me after the show. He was very kind. He told me to keep playing with heart." The audience in the studio applauded again. They could feel her sincerity. There was something pure about her, something untouched by ego. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the Maestro sat in his office, reading an article about the whole event. For the first time in years, he wasn't reading about himself as the center of brilliance. The story wasn't about his achievements, his concerts, or his awards. It was about a teenager who had reminded people why music mattered in the first place. He smiled faintly and leaned back in his chair. The truth was, her music had stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded him of when he was young, before fame, before the critics, before the pressure to be perfect. When he played simply because he loved the sound of it, he made a decision that morning. He picked up his phone and called the show's producer. "I'd like to invite her to perform at my orchestra's annual gala," he said. "It's next month." The news traveled fast. When the girl heard about the invitation, she froze. "He wants me to play with him?" she asked in disbelief. Her parents were speechless too. It was an honor beyond anything they could have imagined. That gala was famous around the world, broadcast live, attended by the most respected musicians and critics. Her mother held her hand tightly. "You have to do it," she said softly. "Not to prove anything, just to play like you always do." In the days that followed, she practiced harder than ever. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she wanted to be ready. Every morning she sat by the piano in her small living room, the same piano she had learned on, its keys worn and slightly uneven. Her fingers moved with emotion, sometimes shaky, sometimes powerful. Every note carried a piece of her story. The day of the gala arrived. The hall was grand and filled with people dressed in their best. Cameras and reporters lined the red carpet outside. Inside, the air was alive with anticipation. The Maestro, dressed in his formal suit, stood backstage waiting. When he saw her walking toward him, he smiled genuinely for the first time. "You came," he said warmly. She nodded nervously. "Thank you for inviting me." He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Thank you for reminding me why I love music." When they walked onto the stage together, the audience stood and clapped even before a single note was played. The Maestro gestured for silence, then turned to her with a soft nod. "Shall we?" he said. She sat down, her fingers hovering above the keys. The Maestro took his place beside her. The lights dimmed, and the first few notes floated into the air. This time they weren't competitors. They were collaborators, two people speaking the same language through music. As they played, something magical happened. Their styles blended perfectly. His precision and her emotion created a sound that was both powerful and tender. It wasn't about technique or perfection anymore. It was about connection. Each note carried warmth, respect, and understanding. The audience sat in silence, captivated. Halfway through the piece, the Maestro let her take the lead. He followed her rhythm, letting her emotion guide the tempo. It was a small gesture, but everyone in the audience noticed it. It was his way of showing humility, of saying without words that he now saw her as an equal. When the last note faded into silence, there was a heartbeat of stillness, and then the hall erupted into applause. People stood cheering and crying at the same time. Some had tears rolling down their faces. They knew they had witnessed something rare, a moment of transformation and grace. The Maestro stood and looked at her with genuine pride. He took her hand and raised it high for everyone to see. "This," he said softly into the microphone, "is what true music sounds like." She blushed, her eyes wide, unsure how to respond. She hadn't expected praise. She hadn't expected to share the stage with the very person who once doubted her. But here they were, standing together, no rivalry left, only respect. After the performance, the press gathered around them backstage. Reporters asked countless questions, but she answered simply, always giving credit to her family, her teachers, and even the maestro. When someone asked if she felt proud to have proven him wrong, she smiled and said, "He wasn't wrong. He just helped me find my right." Her words spread across the world the next day. People quoted her in articles, calling her the pianist with a humble soul. The maestro, now quieter than before, found himself listening more than talking. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to defend his reputation. Instead, he felt grateful. The gala had been more than a concert. It was a reminder that music isn't about winning or losing. It's about truth. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in for the girl, from music schools, festivals, and television shows. But she didn't rush to accept them. She wanted time to breathe, to understand what this new chapter meant. She returned home to her small town and spent a few quiet days walking near the river, thinking about everything that had happened. Her neighbors greeted her proudly, telling her how they all watched her on television. Children pointed and smiled when she passed by, but she stayed humble, always saying the same thing: "I just played from my heart." One afternoon, she received a handwritten letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting elegant and old-fashioned. It was from the maestro. Inside, the letter read, "Music is a language that only honesty can speak. You reminded me of that. Thank you. Never stop playing the way you feel. It's rarer than perfection." She read the letter several times, smiling softly each time. It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. It was respect, pure and quiet. Months passed, and her life slowly found balance again. She continued her studies, practiced daily, and occasionally performed at small concerts. Each time she sat at the piano, she remembered that night, how fear had turned into freedom, how humility had turned into strength. And far away, the maestro continued his own journey too. In his next performances, people noticed something different about him. His playing had changed. It had warmth again. It had feeling. Critics wrote that he seemed reborn, as though he had found something he had lost long ago. Whenever asked what had inspired the change, he would simply smile and say, "A reminder from a very young teacher." The world had seen a confrontation between generations, but what they really witnessed was something deeper, a conversation between hearts through music. And though their paths were different, both the young pianist and the old maestro carried the same truth within them: that music, at its purest, belongs not to the perfect, but to the sincere. The viral clip continued to circulate for years. People still watched it whenever they needed hope or a reminder that humility and courage can exist together. And in every home where that video played, someone somewhere smiled, feeling inspired to pick up an instrument or chase a forgotten dream. For the girl, that was the greatest reward of all, not the fame, not the applause, but the quiet knowledge that her truth had reached hearts she'd never meet. And every time she sat at her piano, she would close her eyes and play the same melody, the one that had changed everything, still imperfect, still full of feeling, and still hers forever. The months after the gala were filled with change. The young pianist's life slowly transformed, though she tried her best to keep her heart the same. Every morning she still woke up early, made her own tea, and practiced on the same old piano that had shaped her childhood. The keys were a little more worn now, some notes slightly out of tune, but that didn't matter to her. She loved it that way. It reminded her of where she came from. The world, however, didn't stop noticing her. The viral video of her and the maestro had now reached millions of people. Teachers showed it to their students. News programs replayed it every few weeks, and strangers from faraway countries sent her letters. They wrote about how her courage inspired them to follow their own dreams. Some said her music had brought them comfort during hard times. She often sat quietly reading these messages, sometimes with tears in her eyes, amazed at how far one moment of truth could travel. Despite all the fame, she remained humble. She didn't rush to record albums or sign contracts, even though many offers came. Instead, she told everyone the same thing: she wanted to keep learning. She knew that true growth in music and in life took time. Her parents supported her completely, proud of the way she stayed grounded even as her world expanded. One crisp autumn morning, she received a phone call from a local music school. The director wanted to invite her to teach a few beginner classes to children. She hesitated at first. Teaching felt like a big responsibility, but she agreed after thinking it over. She remembered how, when she was younger, she had longed for someone to guide her. Maybe now she could be that person for others. Her first day at the school was filled with nervous excitement. The classroom was bright, filled with small pianos lined up neatly. The children looked at her with wide eyes, whispering to one another, recognizing her from television. She smiled warmly and told them, "Don't worry about being perfect. Just listen to what the music wants to say." The room went quiet, and the children nodded, ready to learn. Teaching turned out to be one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. Watching those young hands slowly find their rhythm reminded her why she had started playing in the first place. Sometimes the kids made mistakes and laughed, and she laughed with them. There was no judgment, no pressure, just joy. Meanwhile, the maestro continued his journey too. He had changed in ways few expected. His public image softened. He became known for his humility and newfound warmth. In interviews, he spoke openly about the night that changed him, often mentioning the young pianist. "She reminded me," he would say, "that music is not a race, it's a conversation." His words touched many, and even those who had once feared his sharp criticism began to see him differently. One evening, months after the gala, he called her again. She was surprised to hear his voice, but happy too. "How have you been?" he asked. "Busy teaching," she said with a small laugh. "Good," he replied. "That's the best kind of busy." Then he paused for a moment before continuing. "I'm organizing a new concert. I'd like you to perform with me again, but this time not on a big stage. Something smaller, more intimate. Just music and people." She smiled as she listened. "I'd love to," she said simply. The concert was held in a small-town theater. There were no bright television lights, no judges, no pressure. Just an audience of about 100 people sitting close enough to see every expression. The maestro played a few solo pieces, then invited her to join him. Together they played a new composition, one they had written together. It was a blend of his structure and her freedom, a perfect reflection of what they had both learned from each other. When the final note ended, the room was filled with soft applause. It wasn't loud or wild, but it was heartfelt. People stood smiling with tears in their eyes. The maestro turned to her and whispered, "You see? This is what it's all about." She nodded, her heart full. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being felt. After the concert, the two sat in the empty theater talking quietly as the stage crew packed up. "You've grown," he said thoughtfully. "You play with even more heart now." She smiled. "That's because I stopped being afraid," she replied. He looked at her with gentle eyes. "Fear keeps many great musicians from finding their true sound," he said. "But you found yours early." As they talked, a young boy from the audience approached shyly, holding a small notepad. "Can I get your autograph?" he asked. The girl smiled, took his notebook, and signed it. Then she said softly, "Do you play the piano?" He nodded. "A little," he said. "But I get scared on stage." She handed him back the notebook and said, "Everyone gets scared. Even me. But when you play, don't think about who's watching. Just think about the sound. Let it be your friend." The boy grinned and nodded before running back to his parents. The maestro watched the exchange, smiling quietly. "You're already passing it on," he said. Over the following years, her life continued to unfold in beautiful, unexpected ways. She performed at concerts around the world, but always chose carefully which ones to play. She avoided the glamorous ones where people came just to be seen. Instead, she chose events where music truly mattered. Fundraisers, community gatherings, and small venues where the connection felt real. Each performance carried the same warmth that had once silenced an entire hall during her first televised show. The maestro and she stayed in touch, occasionally performing together or exchanging letters. Their friendship became something deeply meaningful. There was no competition, no pride, just mutual respect and the quiet understanding shared only by people who had both learned something from each other. One winter evening, she received a letter from him again. His handwriting looked a little shakier this time. It said, "My dear friend, if you are reading this, it means I'm taking a break from performing. Age is catching up to me, but my heart still listens to music every day. I wanted to tell you something I never said before. You changed my life. You reminded me that even after a lifetime of teaching, there is always more to learn. Thank you for that gift. Keep playing, and keep teaching others to feel. With respect and gratitude, your friend always." She read the letter several times and pressed it gently to her heart. It felt like a closing chapter, but also a blessing. The next week, she dedicated one of her concerts to him. Before she began to play, she spoke softly to the audience. "This piece is for the person who once told me that music is discipline, and later reminded me that it's also freedom." The hall was silent as her fingers touched the keys. The melody floated like a memory, gentle and full of love. Years passed and her journey continued. She opened a small music academy in her hometown, where children from all backgrounds could learn without worrying about money. The walls were covered with drawings, letters, and old photos of her performances. But what made her proudest wasn't the pictures. It was the sound of young laughter and music echoing through the hallways. Sometimes, when she had a quiet evening alone, she would sit by her old piano and play the same piece she had once played on that television stage long ago, the one that started it all. She played it differently now, richer, deeper, filled with everything she had lived and learned. And every time she reached the final note, she would smile softly, imagining the maestro somewhere out there listening, still tapping his fingers along to the rhythm. The world remembered her story not as a tale of rivalry or revenge, but as one of courage, humility, and connection. People called it the night when music defeated ego. But to her, it was never about defeat, it was about rediscovery. The rediscovery of what music truly meant. A bridge between hearts, a language of truth, and so life moved forward, quietly and beautifully. New faces appeared on stages, new talents emerged, and the world kept changing. But the story of that night, the night a teenage pianist reminded a world-famous maestro of the soul behind the notes, lived on. It was shared in classrooms, whispered in music studios, and remembered by every artist who had ever doubted themselves. Years later, one of her students asked her during a lesson, "How did you know what to play that day when he challenged you?" She smiled, her eyes soft with memory. "I didn't know," she said. "I just stopped being afraid of making mistakes." The student looked at her thoughtfully. "So, music isn't about being perfect?" She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It's about being honest. And when you're honest, people will always listen." And somewhere, deep inside the quiet of that music room as her students practiced and laughter filled the air, it felt as if the music itself was smiling, timeless, pure, and free.